if you feel up to it, and if you feel up to it and you want to say where you're zooming in from and any organizational affiliation or farm, please do. That just lets us know who's out there, which is great. Okay, well, the waiting room alerts have started to slow down, so I think I'm going to kick things off, and Carl can continue to let people in. I want to welcome you to the Grassland 2.0 Digital Dialogues last webinar of this fall season. And my name is Sarah Lloyd, and I work for the Grassland 2.0 project as a supply chain development specialist. And one of our colleagues here at Grassland 2.0, John Strausser, kind of took the lead on these digital dialogues for this fall and had that centered around the idea of placemaking. And so Grassland 2.0 is a project. It's based out of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It's a 5-year project. And it's really looking at how we can, together with farmers and landowners, with eaters, with people who work for county agencies, in conservation departments, working for the NRCS, people interested in conservation, nonprofit organizations, how we can all work together to think about agricultural systems that can transition to reach our shared goals of water quality, of soil health, farm viability, and community vitality. Our agricultural systems are complex, and we have complex issues impacting our land, the water, the climate, and our communities, and our farm business people and the workers. And so I was really excited to be able to get Dennis Olson from United Food and Commercial Workers International Union to come and talk with us today about kind of connecting the dots on that system. When we talk about agriculture and production systems, we don't always put the needed spotlight on the workers in these systems. Dennis is going to speak more directly about opportunities for workers in the meat packing sector, and this is obviously a critical part of how these systems come together, how our agricultural production gets processed, moves into our food systems, and how that all connects back to climate change, land use. And so that's what we want to talk about today. I want to introduce Dennis Olson, who I've known for, I'm not sure, Dennis, probably at least 10 years, if not longer.
Yeah.
And Dennis works for United Food and Commercial Workers International Union. He is advising the director of the meatpacking division on food, agriculture, and trade policies. UFCW, United Food and Commercial Workers, is a union in the US and Canada. It represents workers. It has 1.3 million members. The members work in grocery and retail stores, pharmacies, healthcare and manufacturing facilities, and in food processing and meat packing industries. And Dennis is very active in the good food purchasing policy work across the country and part of the National Campaign Committee for the Center for Good Food Purchasing. He's also been very active in workers coming together in new opportunities around hemp and other products. I know that in the past, even before he came to UFCW, he worked in the Northern Great Plains and the Mountain West for 17 years, working with conservation organizations and farmers and ranchers. So Dennis really brings a broad experience to the table here today. And one of the things that when I first met Dennis, what I really like about talking to you, Dennis, is that you always tell me things that kind of blow my mind. And so one of the things that I always remember is you were sharing with me the research that you and others had been looking at that was showing that as the US diet was shifting to like more chicken consumed per capita, that actually was having a direct impact on how workers were experiencing the meatpacking industry, because due to historical patterns and economic power issues, there is less union representation and union contracts in the chicken processing plants. And so that was something I had never really thought about, like that connection to like what the diet of Americans are and like how that impacts workers. And so that's why I always like talking to you. And I really just think that bringing your thoughts and analysis into our conversation here at Grassland 2.0 is really valuable. And so I do want to kick things over to you to share how you see, what's going on with workers in the meat processing sector. What are some of the opportunities to really think about new economic and enterprise structures that maybe give workers more control and even ownership in their workplace? How do we think about bringing the next generation of workers and owners into the conversation? And importantly, how we process our meat connect back to issues of land use and climate change and what the opportunities are. And I'm excited to hear what you have to say. So I will pass it on to you, Dennis Olson from United Food and Commercial Workers International Union.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and thanks to the Grasslands 2.0 for inviting me today. Thank you for that introduction. So you pretty much covered, that who we are, who I am, and who I'm working for now, the UFCW. I would just kick it off here. I would just try to summarize some of the themes I'm going to hit on, which are some of the ones you just mentioned. So this is about, so what I'm going to try to do is go back to the history of UFCW in getting engaged in the climate debate, going back to when did that really kick in and start to happen? What were the factors that got our attention and made us pivot towards realizing that we had to really engage in this debate and come up with solutions to these challenges, especially in regard to a just transition for Packinghouse workers in the context of the climate crisis. And an overarching theme here is going to be that rebuilding the U.S. cattle herd is both a climate imperative for a climate mitigation strategy. It is also an imperative for curtailing the erosion of labor standards in the meatpacking sector in general. So that's kind of where I'm going to hope to go with this. So I wanted to just start off here. This is a map of the Keystone Pipeline, and also it includes going across its route going across the Ogallala Aquifer. And I just wanted to touch on this because, President Obama denied the permit. President Trump came in and reversed that decision. And now President Biden has come in and reversed it again. And a big part of the debate, of course, is about jobs, and being a labor union, we're always concerned about jobs. but you know, and there's been a lot of hype on a lot of different fronts on this, but some numbers thrown around. But these numbers are from the EIS that was done by the State Department. So there are about 4,000 jobs that would have been created by the pipeline, but 3,900 of those are temporary 4 to 8 month jobs. And then there's another 50 that are going to be permanent, but 15 of those are going to be in Canada. And in contrast to that, we have over 400,000 workers. They're not all UFCW, but the meatpacking sector has over 400,000 workers in the meatpacking sector. So, and the point I'm trying to make here is if that pipeline were to spill into the Ogallala and impair and damage the Ogallala, we have tens of thousands of jobs that good paying union jobs that are at risk because of that. And because basically the Ogallala is providing the irrigation for both the livestock that our members are harvesting. So just wanted to point that out, that we have a dog in this fight as well. So just to kind of want to kick it off with that. So now I'm just going to go back and start this story, like going back to the drought of 2011 and 12 is where we really kind of got not hit between the eyes with climate change, with that drought, and what people may not remember. Some people probably remember, some people may not remember or realize that the drought actually started in 2011 in the Southern Plains. And then Texas, which is the biggest cattle producing state in the United States. And so by the end of 2011, the cattle producers in Texas had liquidated about somewhere around half of the cattle in Texas, because their wells were drying up, their pastures were drying up, and the price of corn and soybeans was going through the roof. And so the cattle herd had already taken, the overall cattle herd had already taken a pretty big hit in 2011. And then the drought just continued into 2012 and expanded and deepened into the rest of the country, so that by 2000, cattle herd had fallen to its lowest level since 1941. And that's what this graph illustrates here. You can see the cattle herd going down and then just sort of falling off a cliff from the drought. And then it rebounded a bit there, and we'll talk more about that later. So in the wake of that drought, we had 9 beef packing plants shut down across the country, including 4 union plants. So that was what really got our attention. And we held an emergency meeting in Chicago with our local unions, that all the local unions that have packing plants, and brought in Daryl Ray from the University of Tennessee to help us out, and some USDA economists to try to get an analysis of what all these impacts would be, and try to start getting a sense of what positions we should be thinking about taking on this issue of climate volatility. So I'm going to zoom back out here to more of a 50,000 foot historical level from the drought, and put it more in context, in a little more historical context, especially in relation to NAFTA. So NAFTA was passed in 1994, and basically what NAFTA did is it broke what is known as the cattle cycle. So up until NAFTA was passed, we had a cattle cycle in this country that basically the way it worked is as prices started to rise, ranchers would hold back their female heifer calves for breeding and herd rebuilding, and as they, because there was economic to have the calf, and because prices were high, so that's how it worked. And they would hold back those heifers, and they would have calves, and the herd would slowly build up, and then the herd would get to a point where there was too many cattle and an oversupply, and the price would start to come down, and the cattle ranchers would start selling off their heifers, and the herd would go back down. And that would take about a 7 to 10 year cycle. And that goes, if pre-NAFTA, that goes back as far as they kept records for it. But when they passed NAFTA broke the cattle cycle. And the reason it broke the cattle cycle is NAFTA got rid of tariffs. And when they got rid of tariffs between Mexico and us and Canada and us, the big packers acquired feedlots in both Canada and Mexico. And so every time that cattle herd that price started to come up and the cattle herd started to rebuild, the packers could just release those cattle, send those cattle over the border to their packing plants in the United States and kill the price. And you can see the result here, how after NAFTA, the cattle herd has continued to decline. It's never been as big as it was in 1996, which was the last peak. And it sort of limped along for all this time. And then that drought hit in 2011. You can see it the drought kind of pushed the herd off the cliff. And then again, you see this little bounce again that I'm going to talk about later. But basically, the point being that the jury's still out on whether the cattle herd's really going to rebuild. So this is another look at that same, another angle of that same point, right? So even before NAFTA, we have not produced enough cattle in the United States to meet domestic demand. I think it's since 1957. So even before NAFTA, we were meeting 7% of domestic beef demand with imported beef and cattle. And then after NAFTA, with that dismantling of tariffs and this influx of live cattle coming in, and also the expansion of NAFTA into other trade agreements like the CAFTA and some of the South American countries, Colombia and Uruguay, Australia, that opened the floodgates for both. NAFTA opened the floodgates primarily for live cattle, and those other agreements opened the floodgates for beef, so that after NAFTA, cattle imports went from supplying 7% of the U.S. domestic demand to almost triple to 20% today, because from both imported beef and imported cattle. And so going back to the drought, as the herd collapsed and these beef plants shut down, that caused a cattle shortage, and you had a spike in beef prices at the retail level. And basically what happened is poultry ramped up production and accelerated its takeover of market share of beef, which is what Sarah was sort of referencing before, that's been going on for 40 years already. And here's a graph showing that rise in broiler production at the expense of both beef and pork. And sort of really the underlying reason for that is biology. So it takes 39 months from conception to slaughter to bring a calf to harvest, and it takes 9 months or less from egg to slaughter for chicken. And so chicken is much more flexible and resilient in the face of market volatility. And so they're able to ramp up production a lot faster, and that's what they did. And they took more market share away from beef. So, oops, didn't mean to skip forward there. Uh-oh. And I can't see because this is, sorry about that.
You were able to go back. We saw the first one, but yeah, I'll keep going. I think you got to go back too. You're at poultry density right now. All right. Oh.
Okay, still got to keep going. Sorry, I glitched this. Keeps jumping forward to that. Let's see. Okay, one more try. Okay, here we are. That's where I need to be. All right, so this is a problem for us because our best measurement of labor standards is union density. So in pork, before the drought, we were at 71% union density, and after the drought, we were at 64% union density. And what that means is, when I say union density, what that means is 71% of the poundage of pork production in the United States produced in union plants. Okay, so that doesn't mean that every worker that's in those plant is a union member, because you have right to work, and some members, so that means that workers have the right to decide whether they join the union or not. But whether they join the union or not, there's been a collective bargaining agreement that's negotiated wages and benefits. So this means that 71% of the pork production in the United States is being produced in plants that have a union contract. So that is the best measure of union labor standards, because the more union density you have, the more leverage you have to negotiate better contracts. And so in beef, it went, and now I can't see this because there's this bar in front of it and I don't know how to get rid of it. But what does it say for the 2000, the later one? I have 62% for beef. I think it's 57.
Yeah, 57.
57, okay.
57 in 2021.
So we updated these last year. So these are the numbers. 2010, we had those numbers, and we updated them last year. And so beef went from 62 to 57. Now I lost there's poultry. Okay. And even poultry itself fell from 33 to 31. And so this is the problem, is that Sarah was mentioning earlier. This is our Achilles heel, is the poultry sector. And frankly, it's because the poultry sector is predominantly located in the former slaveholding South, where there is a plantation mentality and a very anti-union culture that makes it really tough to organize down there. And so poultry, in essence, so if you take that, one of our plants was that Cargill beef plant in Plainview, Texas. At one point, at their peak, they were employing 2,000 workers in that beef plant at union scale, wages and benefits, and that plant just shut down in the wake of the drought because they ran out of cattle to produce, and those workers were laid off. And so in essence, what was happening during the drought is that plant was producing X million pounds of beef per year at a union scale, and it is in essence being displaced by non-union poultry plants in the South. So we're arguing that poultry is dragging down the labor standards in all three protein sectors. And this is the heifer replacement. This is what I was sort of referencing before. So you can see the herd bottomed out in 2014. There was actually a price spike that spurred some herd rebuilding because it gave the prices went up, and that gave the ranchers the incentive to hold back those heifers. And what this graph is heifer replacement, right? Like, are they selling them off or not? And so they're holding them back, and you can see that spike there, but then you say it taper off. And that's because the prices went down again, and the cattle cycle was broken. And frankly, I'm just going to say it right here. The reason it went down is the packers have enough market power to manipulate the price, and they don't like paying higher prices for cattle. So they manipulated the price, and the prices went down, and they broke the cattle cycle again, which is what I was talking about earlier. That's one reason, I mentioned that biology is one reason that poultry is more successful than the other sectors, has been more successful. And again, this is beyond the drought. The other reason, the poultry, again, I can't see the title of this. Now, what does this title one say?
Poultry has increased from 29% of animal slaughtering and processing employment in 1976 to almost half.
The other top bar.
Oh, no. Why is poultry so successful?
Oh, okay. So anyway, this just shows you the historical growth of poultry. So in 76, 29%. By 17, it was almost half. And I checked before I did this presentation, it's now over half. So it's been a rapid rise. And part of the argument is that they made, and they were very good at marketing stuff. So the white meat, right, the red meat, there was a big backlash against red meat being unhealthy, and people shifted to that. A lot of other good marketing stuff. But the real reason is that poultry is the most exploitative supply chain. So from the worker perspective, here's one example of that, where this just shows you red meat, which is pork and beef, is the blue line, and poultry is the bottom line. And wages have historically, poultry wages are lower than red meat. It's about $3 per hour difference. So that was example of why it's exploitative for workers. The other is it's exploitative for farmers. And people have probably heard some of the horror stories about the poultry contract system and how exploitative that is. But I'm going to go drill a little deeper down into the Freedom to Farm Bill, the 96 Farm Bill, which was labeled by proponents the Freedom to Farm Bill, get the government out under, that was the carryover from Ronald Reagan's term, was the big mantra. But the critics of Freedom to Farm called it the Freedom to Fail, because what it did is it stripped out the last remnants of supply management that were left over from the New Deal, namely strategic grain reserves, acreage set-asides, and a price floor in the market, because you can put a price floor in the market when you do supply management. It just jettisoned all of that stuff and unleashed overproduction, and that drove prices far below the cost of production. So Tufts University in 2007 researched this and came up with this study, Feeding at the Trough, and so they were able to break that down and figure out that the price of feed grains fell anywhere during that time, ranged from 15 to 25% below the cost of production. And then they took that figure and added it up and divvied it up among industrial chicken, beef, pork, and dairy. And if you add that up, all four of those sectors up over the life of the Farm Bill, it amounts to a $35 billion indirect subsidy to the industrial meat system, livestock and meat system. And so I would argue, a lot of people don't like confined animal feedlot operations, and we need to regulate them and do things to try to curtail them. And so far, nothing's curtailed them. They continue to expand. They continue to get bigger. And I would argue that this is the main economic driver, this indirect feed subsidy, because feed prices are the single biggest cost in a pound of meat, any pound of meat, whether it's chicken, beef, or pork. But it's actually more beneficial to the poultry sector, because it's 32% of the cost of a pound of chicken, and that's twice as much as it is for beef and 3 times as much as it is for pork. So that deregulation of the Farm Bill actually contributed to the success of the poultry sector over the red meat sector. And the result, here's a chart showing the results. So the USDA projections are that poultry will continue to expand at the expense of beef and pork. So the cattle herd went off the cliff. The workers went off the cliff with the loss of, with the plant shutdowns, and the other people who went off the cliff were cattle ranchers, right? So this is just showing you again that it goes back to NAFTA, breaking the cattle cycle, and the loss of cattle ranchers since that time has just plummeted. And this shows you the cattle rancher share of the consumer beef dollar, of course, is also going down, except, again, I mentioned 2014 was the bottom of when the herd bottomed out in the wake of the drought. And you can see here, I'd show you the heifer retention before, and here's the actual price spike that caused that heifer retention. So here it's even more dramatic. It comes across more dramatically. You see that price spike, which again would have been the driver for herd rebuilding, But again, I would argue, and we can talk, people can ask me more questions about this later, but I would just argue that that is the ability of the big packers to manipulate the price and not wanting to pay that price for beef. So they manipulate the price, and there's nothing the ranchers can do about it. So that's why they break the rebuilding of the cattle herd. So this was, the drought chart of 21. I showed the earlier one. So, there were drought, people were worried about this after the drought of 11 and 12. It wasn't as bad this year, but I would argue, it's not a matter of if there's going to be another drought. It's a matter of when there's going to be another drought. It wasn't as bad this year, but it's a matter of if, not when, we're going to have another drought and how bad it's going to be. And keep in mind that during the 30s, we had several years straight of drought that caused the Dust Bowl, right? So the question is, we know this is going to happen, and what are we going to do about it? So again, back to this theme of rebuilding the cattle herd, one of the current obstacles to rebuilding the cattle herd is the bad rap that beef is getting in the climate debate, because it does contribute 40% of agricultural emissions. There's some argument about the exact percentage. You can get into the weeds on that, but there's no denying that the methane that are produced by cows because of those emissions are a major factor that are a problem. And so, like in the Good Food Purchasing Policy, we've had environmental groups put forward that, well, school districts can do meatless Mondays, so that they, as a way to comply with the environmental sustainability. And I don't really have a problem with that. What I have a problem with is sort of the nuanced soundbite that, if everybody just stops eating beef, we're going to solve the climate crisis, right? That's the best thing an individual can do, is to stop eating beef. And it may be one of the best things you can do as an individual, but we have to look at the big picture and look at these nuances, like labor standards, for example. So one of the silver linings is, for many years now, has been that there has been a steady rising demand, for lack of a better term, good meat, whether you call it grass-fed or local or antibiotic-free, etc. And a few years ago, it was about grass-fed's one of those categories that there's some measurement of it, right? So you can it's a little ambiguous of what that good meat really means, and grass-fed is about as explicit as you can get. So a few years ago, grass-fed was about 7% of US beef sales, and at one point was projected to be a 25% annual increase. And this is a reflection of a rise in consumer consciousness of knowing where their meat comes from, right? They want to know, and how it's produced. And so that was happening. And the problem was, as soon as Chipotle and some of these other retail chains that wanted to capitalize on that went to do that, they actually started marketing grass-fed as a thing. They immediately found out that we hadn't made the transition to grass-fed yet in the United States, so they didn't have enough supply to meet that demand. And so what did they do? They took advantage of our flawed trade policy, and they imported a lot of grass-fed beef from South America, which is all grass-fed beef, and marketed as the sustainable beef, which, it's grass-fed, so that's fair enough. But what that did is it killed the premium for grass-fed beef for ranchers in the United States, and stalled the transition to grass-fed beef in the United States. So again, this is an example of why we need country of origin labeling and other reforms and trade reform in general to try to address some of these impacts. So speaking of cool, I wanted to zero in on cool here a little bit. This is a pretty good slide. So some people on this call, I'm sure quite a few maybe, know the rough history of cool. It was passed in the 2002 Farm Bill. The Bush administration came in, and frankly, they just stalled it. They didn't do anything. They didn't implement it, and the price stayed flat pretty much for that whole 8 years of the Bush administration. And then you can see starting in 2009 that the Obama administration came in, and to their credit and to Vilsack's credit, they started implementing cool, but the Packers were fighting it tooth and nail every step of the way. They did not want cool because they bring that grass-fed beef from South America and they mix it with the grain-fed beef in the United States for hamburger. And if they have to label it, they could have as many as 17 different countries on the label. And they know that would be a bad thing for them, right? People would start asking questions as why is these beef being sourced from how is that even possible that it's coming from 17 different countries, right? So they didn't want it and they fought it, but they got it implemented. And so, of course, the Packers sued immediately. And their argument was that somehow country of origin labeling was a violation of their First Amendment rights to free speech, that they shouldn't be required to say, because that was a violation of their right to free speech, where the beef comes from, right? Well, the courts didn't buy it and they upheld cool. And so we have a law that was passed by the US Congress, signed by a US president, and upheld by US courts. So you think game was over, but of course it wasn't, because they went to the WTO and went to Canada and Mexico and filed a WTO complaint that ruled in favor of Canada and Mexico and struck cool down. And the Obama administration refused to appeal it. They didn't exhaust their appeal decision. There were further arguments to be made. But once they didn't repeal it, Mexico threatened retaliatory tariffs on produce and other things, and really they target those tariffs. And so the House, the Congress just totally caved and overwhelmingly repealed cool. And the result was, you can see this dramatic collapse of price because cool was repealed. So it's pretty clear, pretty good evidence about how cool and consumer preference could be a driver in rebuilding the cattle herd. This is just a good food purchasing policy. Let's see if I need to go back here. I just did it. Okay. Sorry. So we touched on, so what are our strategies? So cool is one of our strategies that we endorse cool. There's a mandatory cool bill now that has, it's actually limited just to beef, but it's got bipartisan support, and it would try to reverse that WTO decision. So we support that, and we've supported cool in other ways all along. And then we're also supporting procurement reform, as Sarah mentioned, and the good food purchasing policy is a value-based procurement program with 5 value categories with certifications, third-party independent certifications like a union contract, USDA organic, locally grown certifications that actually mean something, that create a scoring system. And that was passed first in LA and has now been expanded to 60 major school districts and other public institutions that buy food across the country. So we've been working on that. And these are some of the cities that have adopted and implemented and have coalitions. And so that's so procurement is another strategy. And then finally, another strategy is, we think we need to dust off the old New Deal supply management bill and have another debate about that in the current context. And so how do you do that? Well, National Farmers Union actually introduced a bill in 2015 that they renamed the market-driven inventory system, but it's basically a modernized version of the old New Deal supply management, because it would reestablish a strategic grain reserve with a floor price at the cost of production that provides a fair price for farmers. But it would also provide a price ceiling, which has always been implied in supply management with a strategic grain reserve. But has never really been part of the debate historically over supply management, because the debate historically has always been over the price floor and what is a fair price for farmers and whether we need to do that or not, because we've never really had shortages before. But what the drought and COVID and the Ukrainian war have shown is now we're facing shortages. So I think those developments make the case for at least putting supply management back on the table and having some more discussion about it. And Farmers Union hired Darrell Ray from the University of Tennessee to crunch the numbers on this. And so he has modeling that helps make those arguments, and and there's a study that he did that you can look at on what the benefits of that would be. So those are, you know, three of the big solutions that we're trying to move. And again, I just like to say the part of the reason I know Sarah as well as I do is for 10 years, we've been in this discussion with her and other farmers union leaders about the need to like rekindle that old farmer labor alliance from the New Deal that actually helped pass the New Deal. And so I think we need to have that alliance rekindled along with other alliances, including the people who care about climate, other sectors, other constituencies who care about climate. And so I want to take a look at this whole picture from that climate perspective. And this is cattle feedlots, right? So this is sort of mirrors the loss of cattle producers with NAFTA, and you can see the number of cattle feeders fell off the cliff along with the herd in the drought of 2011 and 12. But from a climate perspective, you know, if you go back to like the 1970s, we probably had 40 to 50,000 independent family farm feedlot operations in the Midwest, and they're all growing corn and soybeans, but they also, every one of them pretty much had a sustainable pasture rotation on their place where they fed that corn and soybeans to their own animals. But they also fattened the cattle from further west, like where I'm from Montana. They would take those cattle where we don't have the crop systems out there and fatten those cattle before slaughter. So that whole system was up and running. But as the agribusiness lobby won the debate over and won agricultural market deregulation, culminating in the passage of the 96 Farm Bill with complete deregulation, basically, what that meant is that the Cargills of the world could buy the grain on the open market for 25% below the cost of production, feed it to their own cattle in their own feedlots. And these family farm feeding operations, they're paying the actual cost of production. So there's no way that their dairy and their meat can compete with that CAFO meat that's premised on this cheap feed subsidy. And so what did they do? They sold those cattle off, plowed up those sustainable pasture rotations, which only exacerbated the overproduction problem and made it worse. And from a climate perspective, it was an unmitigated disaster, because what it did is it moved millions of head of cattle off of millions of acres of sustainable pasture rotations that were rebuilding soil and fixing carbon, and moved them into CAFOs that are dependent on fossil fuel, corn and soybeans, feed grains. So that's a climate disaster. You know, we need to get those, and this is where I'm saying we need to have more nuance than everybody should stop eating beef, because we need those cattle back out on sustainable pasture rotations to start rebuilding the soil. Another angle on the climate question in the cattle herd is, if we can't rebuild the cattle herd, if we're not able to overcome all these challenges that are being arrayed against rebuilding the cattle herd, and we end up dumping our demand, U.S. demand for beef onto Brazil and South America, well, that's going to just expand the cattle herd in Brazil and South America into the rainforest and accelerate deforestation. So then what becomes of the greenhouse gas footprint of beef if you take that into account? So we need to prevent that from happening. That's why we need a cattle herd. And along those lines, some recent figures on this. So in April, U.S. imports of beef from Brazil were 30% higher than a year ago. imports from Brazil have accounted for more than half of that overall increase. And Brazil has gone from 2% of the beef import market to 15%. So there's evidence that it's actually happening, right? This is happening in real time right now, and it's a threat. So yes, cows have the biggest greenhouse footprint, but so pivoting back to supply management, what would that do to would it shrink the greenhouse gas footprint of beef, the carbon footprint of beef? And we argue that it would reduce the amount of, because the grains are going to be more expensive. It's not going to stop the use of corn and soybeans for finishing cattle. That's going to continue, but we're probably it would go back to something like the 1970s, where instead of fattening these cattle up to 1,400 pounds like we do today, they only fattened them up to 10 or 1,100 pounds before they slaughtered them, because you couldn't afford to pay more. If the cheaper it is, the more pounds you can put on with grain. And then the other thing it would do is it would level the playing field between feed grains, this indirect subsidy of feed grains, and pasture rotations, right? So back to those family farm feedlots liquidating those herds, the hope would be that if you actually put the cost of feed grains at the real cost of production, that would provide the ranchers the flexibility to make the transition to grass-fed and start moving some of these cattle out of the CAFOs back out onto sustainable pasture rotations, rebuilding soil health and fixing carbon. And then the last thing it would do would be, and also experimenting, the whole regenerative ag angle with cover crops and even hemp, right? That hemp, Sarah mentioned hemp could be a great cover crop that could provide an alternative revenue stream for farmers and ranchers. And if we could do that and get more cattle out onto more sustainable pasture rotations and break up that corn and soybean monoculture out there that's contributing to the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, not only would it curtail the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, it would make the countryside more resilient to climate volatility of ever more severe strains, floods, storms, floods, and droughts, right? If you had more sustainable pasture rotations. So one of the questions that came up in our internal debate over this is, the reality, though, is if you actually were to go to supply management and go in that direction, it would actually mean a reduction in the pounds of beef produced, because the industrial model, they externalize their cost, and when they externalize those costs, they can produce more cheaper beef, right, and other meats. And this chart just shows that even though the cattle herd has been declining, beef production has continued to climb because of that indirect subsidy and putting more pounds of beef with fossil fuel grain onto the cattle. Well, that's kind of a tough sell to a meatpacking worker, right? That you're actually going to reduce the amount of beef you're going to produce. But so we came at it at this angle. So if you look at what the dress weight of a steer was in 76, about 600 pounds. By 2018, because of the cheap feed subsidy, it was over 800 pounds. Well, if you went back to if this brought it back to 1976 levels, that would mean a 25% reduction in the size of the cattle, right? Or the poundage of meat produced per cow. So that would essentially mean a 25% increase in cattle, the numbers of cattle, which would actually require more workers to kill those cattle. So it's probably not a wash, but it would help mitigate the impacts as far as a just transition for Packinghouse workers. So again, returning to this theme of the rising demand for good meat, if you go back to 67, there were almost 9,700 slaughterhouses, small and medium size, and some large, but not much more small and medium size. And that doesn't even include poultry. And by 2016, it was only 1,100 plants. And of course, they're much bigger. So you have plants like Sioux Falls, South Dakota, the Smithfield plant there. is 20,000 head of hogs a day, and it's 5% of national U.S. pork production. So when it shut down during COVID, you're taking out 5% of the U.S. pork production in one fell swoop. And this is where Vilsack is saying the right things, of saying COVID has exposed the fragility of our supply chain, and the fragility is caused because we've let it get too consolidated, and it needs to be decentralized. And thus his initiative on the $2 billion he's put on the table for to expand meatpacking plants. And this is where Sarah was referencing, I've been working with Farmers Union and others to try to come up. We have a worker-owned co-op model that is a farm in the food of in Cincinnati, and we're taking that model into this farmer labor dialogue with Farmers Union and saying, could we come up with a meatpacking plant or a hemp plant? It could be hemp too. Started it on hemp and then pivoted to meatpacking, but let's stick to meatpacking for now. And so if we could do that, could we launch a hybrid farmer worker-owned meatpacking plant? And for us, what we got to negotiate is neutrality, because we have to have neutrality to make that kind of a commitment, because we can't afford to spend 2 years launching a packing plant to have a union busting manager come in if there's no guarantees against that. So that's where we're at with that, and we're very close to trying to to reach an agreement on that. And if we could, then we could go in for some of that $2 billion and try to get this meat plants up and running. And if we're able to do that, then we're going to have, I would argue, we would have a competitive advantage, because we could have transparent collective bargaining that fairly divvies up the small margins, small to maybe non-existent margins that we're going to face in the short term, at least. If workers can see in transparent collective bargaining, because if it's a worker-owned, if the workers are on the board and see the books, they can see the books, and they can see that it's not smoke and mirrors, that it's a problem, so they know they can't demand the moon. And so if we can divvy that up fairly to everybody's satisfaction, even though everybody's probably not satisfied, because it's going to be small margins, and those workers have a path to worker ownership. And the other piece that we can bring to the table is an apprenticeship, where we could bring in a whole nother revenue stream to launch apprenticeship, to pay for revenues for apprenticeships from the labor department, that adds to the same packing plant that's getting some of that $2 billion that Vilsack has put on the table, right? So I would argue that those three things in particular, would lead us, that packing plant, to have a more stable, would be able to recruit better workers who are more interested who would be interested in a career path, and stabilize that workforce. And that's going to give us a competitive advantage over another packing plant that thinks they're going to go out and find the cheapest labor they can find, which right now I will tell you I would argue is non-existent at this point. And so I think that's the promise of that strategy. So to recap, we need trade policy reform to curtail dumping of cattle into the U.S. market, as I mentioned earlier, to prevent the dumping of U.S. beef demand onto South America, and accelerate deforestation and increase the carbon footprint for beef. And I haven't talked about this, and I won't go into it now. People can ask about it, but we've worked with Farmers Union and the Teamsters to support Canadian Farmers Union and Canadian unions to defend Canadian supply management in poultry and dairy. And for us, the reason we did that is we're at 68% union density in chicken in Canada, compared to 31% in the US. So you just have you have more margins to work with. And of course, another part of trade reform is to reinstate COOL, to harness consumer demand, to give those ranchers the incentive to do herd rebuilding. Procurement, mentioned the GFPP, mentioned the co-ops and the apprenticeship, but we need to have stronger antitrust enforcement. And again, Vilsack is saying the right things. We're actually in a coalition with some of the progressive farm groups who are issuing comments to the USDA on proposals that would be very strong antitrust proposals, because even if we get some of these meatpacking plants up and running with this $2 billion, there's nothing to stop the Tysons of the world they know how far you can ship a cow. So they can go in and offer those ranchers in that region more money on a temporary basis until that plant runs out of cattle to kill. And they can do a lot of other things. And if you don't have a strong antitrust regime to sniff that stuff out and actually do something about it, those plants aren't going to survive the predatory practices that these guys can wield against them. So the other thing is that between the big packers and the big retailers, they have a lock on market access. So antitrust is one way to pry open market access. The other way is procurement, it's public procurement. So if the Good Food Purchase Policy and reform, if we can provide a preference to local fair meat, then we're gonna that can get us market access too. Strategic grain reserve to protect against climate shocks, and getting cattle back out onto sustainable pasture rotations and fixing carbon, rebuilding soil and fixing carbon. So I just want to close with this quote from our local president from 1473 in Wisconsin, John Iden. This came from a press release that we did with Wisconsin Farmers Union in the fall of 2020. And we did this as part of this Farmer Labor Alliance initiative. One of the culminations of this was this press release. And in this press release, Farmers Union supported our demands for better, stronger protections for our workers against COVID and meatpacking plants. And they also explicitly supported the right of workers to organize a union. And we supported farmers' right to a fair price, explicitly endorsing stronger antitrust enforcement and dairy supply management. And this is what John's quote in the press release: empowering farmers to get a fair price and workers to get a fair wage is a trickle-up economic strategy. It is based on the sound premise that Wisconsin's farmers and workers are more likely to spend that money with local businesses than our agribusiness conglomerates whose business model is based on paying farmers and workers as little as they can to provide ever higher returns to their shareholders. Our strategy will make Main Street the priority over Wall Street. Oops. So that's it. Thank you.
All right. Excellent. Thank you very much, Dennis. That was wonderful. And you've blown my mind again, because I'm thinking about all the systems and the complexity, but yet you laid it out so carefully. We are happy to get into question and answer and some discussion. If you want to use the Zoom function to raise your hand, you can do that by going to the reaction at the bottom of your screen, and it lets you click on raise your hand. We can let you unmute yourself and you can ask it directly, or if you'd rather type something into the chat, that works too, and I can read that out. We did have one question back when you were talking about climate change, that do you know if the emissions numbers that kind of compared include tractor emissions?
Yeah, I think theoretically it does. It's a supply chain analysis, so I think they theoretically incorporate all of those emissions along the supply chain. That's my understanding.
Okay.
I think
great.
There's a lot of debate over how that's done, right? It's like that. I don't think there's necessarily a agreed upon template on how you actually measure that. I think there's ongoing debates over how you actually measure that, but supposedly it does. Yes.
Okay, great. Well, if I'm not seeing anyone raising their hand at this point, so I may take on facilitator's privilege and ask you a question. I'm very intrigued by this idea of, thinking through business enterprise models that can put, farmers and workers like in the fight together to build viable enterprises that can pay good prices for animals and pay fair wages. We have heard very clearly in the work that Grassland 2.0 is doing on the ground in Wisconsin and in Minnesota and the upper Midwest in general, that, you know, this issue of the small and medium-sized plants closing down or getting kind of pinched because they're not finding the workers. You know, when you're thinking about these possible alliances, does that work at kind of any scale plant, do you think, or what are some of the considerations in that regard for you for this possible model?
Well, I kind of just scratched the surface because I was trying to get everything in there, but touched on it. So maybe I'll delve into the history of this farmer labor dialogue that's been going on 10 years now. And it actually, again, it started, we got this, our Harvest Co-op in Cincinnati, which is a farm and a food hub that is it's only worker owned. It's not farmer owned, although frankly, it's the farm workers are out there on the farm working. So in some sense, they're farmers, but they're classified as workers. And so the co-op is a worker-owned co-op. But it also has a union contract with our local there. And so the argument was that, so that where the farmer labor dialogue sort of initiated was around cannabis and hemp. I was asked, so UFCW has been organizing in the cannabis sector since 2013, and I was asked to bring this model into the cannabis sector and see if we could get some traction with just the worker-owned co-op stuff. Then hemp was legalized in the Farm Bill, and then all of a sudden it was like some of that production in cannabis, like medical and adult use, almost all of that is vertically integrated inside grow houses, right? Whereas the hemp, some of that, a significant part of that hemp production is going to have to move back out onto the farm. So that kind of, we pivoted towards this farmer labor dialogue, and the idea was with hemp, you have this sector where you don't have an entrenched monopoly like you do in meat packing. It's open. The Wall Street money is not in there yet mainly because of the regulatory uncertainty, right? That the banks won't go in there because even though it's legal federally in the Farm Bill, it's not. If you go over the 0.3% threshold, the farmer can have his crop burned because it's illegal Schedule I cannabis under the federal law. And if a bank is financing that, they can lose their charters over it. So they're not going to touch it until Congress fixes that. And the FDA is slow walking the regulation of cannabinoid oils in gummy bears and stuff because they regulate the use of those additives in food. So that kept Wall Street out. So our idea on the farmer labor dialogue was, hey, we can start the farmer labor dialogue around a political alliance without waiting for anything. Because for example, in Minnesota, we worked hand in glove with Minnesota Farmers Union and a whole coalition of stakeholders under the auspices of the Minnesota Department of Ag to comment on the hemp rules that were coming out of Minnesota and out of the USDA. And so we were starting to build that political relationship doing that, and that alliance on that front and work that coalition out. So that's something you don't have to wait for. Now, what's going to take more time is how do you structure these co-ops? How do you build a hybrid co-op, and how do you do that? And that gets dicey. In the worker-owned model at our Harvest, workers are asked to. It's a real worker-owned co-op, so workers have skin in the game. So they're asked to bring put $10,000 into the co-op. Now that doesn't mean they have to plop down $10,000 up front. What it means is a 3% paycheck deduction going into their share over time and building up. Well, and the model is based on one worker, one vote. They want to keep equality in there. And the thing is, if a farmer comes to the table with $1 million worth of land and equipment, a one worker, one vote, or one worker, one farmer vote might be a tough sell, right? So we got to negotiate those details out. But if we can actually get this model, a template up and running in this sector that so far the Wall Street money is being kept out, which isn't going to last forever, right? That's going to end at some point. Wall Street's going to be in. And but if by the time they get in, if we could get the model up and running and at the same time build the political alliance, then we have a fighting chance to defend that model against the lobbying of the Wall Street, the people who want the Wall Street extractive model. So that's sort of I guess that's my answer.
Okay.
Did
Great.
that answer everything? Are there other questions you wanted to ask, or?
Yeah, well, no, that was good to just get a little bit more background on how that might work, what you've been doing in the cannabis industry. And then we've got some questions that come into the chat. So, Jean asked, if we think about a model that's paying high prices to farmers and equitable wages, of course, the natural question is, well, what's that going to cost the consumer? So I don't know if, in your analysis or you're thinking of kind of how this could come together, how the value flows work or would need to work from farmer to eater.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly maybe the biggest challenge of all, right? Because even all of our work in procurement, for example, one of the biggest challenge that's slowed us down significantly over 10 years has been the mantra that the lowest bid gets the bid, right? In procurement for these school food contracts and stuff. So that's contradictory to all of this fairness in the supply chain, because all this fairness costs money, right? And so I think that's a tough question. I think one answer that's emerged is, for example, in Boston, in their procurement system, and New York is now about to do this. So what they're saying is, what they will say is, if a smaller operator that has fair, more sustainable certifications bids, the policy actually allows that bid to be 10%, up to 10% higher than the lowest bid, and still get the contract. So that's one actual tangible example of where they've moved in a direction to try to fix that. But I think it also comes down, to challenging the market power of the big packers and the big retailers until we have real antitrust enforcement that curtails their at will manipulation of prices and their sweetheart deals, and they're locking people out of markets. Then you're not going to win that battle, and they're going to win the low price thing every time, right? So I think that's the jury's out. I guess the other answer that I've come up with is what I touched on in the presentation, which is, and this is so that, let me just, like in the Our Harvest co-op, when we finally got the worker owned co-op up and running, we had the first 7, it was only 7 worker owners at the beginning, and actually, and then well, it's 7 workers owner and probably 16 total. So the first thing they ran into is there's half their workers were seasonal, so not everybody's going to be a worker owner. But anyway, they got to the point where they had their worker owner board who hired the manager, and under the model, then the worker owners and non-worker owners form a union committee, and the manager, who's hired by the board and accountable to the board, negotiates the contract from the perspective of management and the business to keep the business, and their job is to keep the business viable. And the union committee, even though there may be worker owners on it who have a stake in being an owner, their job is to put their worker hat on and to negotiate the contract from the perspective, the best contract they can from the perspective of a worker, right? And so they sat down to negotiations, and one of the first issues that came up was healthcare. And so this is what I mean by transparent collective bargaining. what happened was half of them were worker owners anyway. They'd already seen the books, but the manager just opens the books and says, here's our margins and here's the cost of the healthcare premium, and we can't afford it. And they all looked at it and they knew that, right? So they said, they agreed that they can't afford it. At that point, the union was able to come in and say, well, if that's the case, then we can offer our healthcare plan at a pretty substantial discount over anything anybody's going to be individually going to get from the Obamacare exchange. So they were able to, and that's how they resolved it in transparent collective bargainings. So that's what I mean by that. It's like, so there's thin margins. You're not going to be able to get everything. You're not going to get everybody the fairest price that they want, or the fairest wage that they want, or the most benefits that they want. But at least it's going to be transparent that they know they've done the best that they can. And I think the other hope is by doing that, you're going to have a much more stable workforce compared to anybody else, and that's going to give you a competitive advantage. But it doesn't, that's not a complete answer to you. I don't think there is a complete answer to that question. I think the other answer is we need to sort of acknowledge that, no, we don't need fragile, global, exploitative supply chains. But on the other hand, there is a kernel of truth to economies of scale. And you have to get to an economies of scale, especially in meat packing, but pretty much in everything. You have to get that price point down. And you have to get it down, number one, if you want to pay workers, you got to increase the margins. So it increases the margins and gives you the leeway to give workers better wage and to give farmers a better price, right? So, you got to have that. And so that's the challenge.
Yeah, and Linda chimed in the chat that, people are paying more for electric vehicles, some operating on climate motivations that they want to be part of the solution. So, there are consumers out there that may be willing to pay more for good climate beef. So that's another kind of wrinkle in if that premium that you kind of discussed, if we can really obtain a premium for grass-fed and good climate beef.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's exactly, that's right, because and that is a way forward too. That's a strategy that you need to think about. And our harvest actually didn't do the procurement, even though they got the good food policy. They pivoted to their community supported agriculture because they could get that premium, and they desperately needed that premium. And so they put their resources into that rather than to get the school food contract, which was the price was going to be too low. So I think in the wake of COVID, you saw some of these small meat retail outlets. I know there was a story from Wisconsin that I read where the shelves were empty at the major grocery stores, so people flooded to these small retail meat retail meat outlet, and and the prices were higher, right? But there was nothing else, so they were able. You'd think their shelves would be empty, but what I read in the article is that store owner had the relationship with the farmers, so he just called around to all the farmers that were already supplying them with X number of pigs, right, and said, "Hey, can you slaughter a few more hogs?" And they were actually flexible enough to ramp that up some to kind of meet that demand. So I think that's the promise, is that COVID even accelerated this consumer consciousness, and they heard about the exploitation of the workers, and so I think there is that just bolstered that potential for a premium for good meat, for example.
Yeah. We had another question kind of going back to the climate issues, and you talked about needing kind of a more nuanced climate message about cattle. And I'm just in the chat there asked, could you kind of say a little bit more about the strategy of creating that more nuanced message on cattle and the need to have animals out in good pasture rotational systems. And, is that something Grassland 2.0 could do to help work on those messages?
Well, the best message that I've been able to think of so far has been more cows on more grass. That gets to everything that's in there, right? It's like, and it doesn't mean everything's going to be grass fed. It doesn't mean you're going to end grain finishing of cattle, but it just means you're going to have more grass and more cows. Like that point about you're going to need more cows, not less, which I guess runs into the climate question, right? It's like that, maybe that's not maybe that is a problem maybe that makes it a problem with the cattle, but hopefully that's offset by moving these cattle out onto sustainable pasture rotations and rebuilding soil and fixing carbon and dovetailing into that whole regenerative ag movement narrative, right? That the cattle are part of that.
Great. I'm trying to catch up here with the questions in the chat here. Oh, I guess there's just a good back and forth going on in the chat, the messaging. Have you seen positive trends in like other protein industries or seafood, or, is there anything to be learned from other products or other food products to bring into this work on meat?
Well, I think that is dovetails into like the procurement, the good food purchasing policy has seafood standards. So, and one of the things you do with the good food purchasing policy is you create local coalitions that reflect those value categories. And I think that is the promise of the good food purchasing policy. Is it was created by the LA Food Policy Council back in like 2011, 12, well, 10, 11, 12, I guess it was. So they took 3 years to develop this policy, and they came up with the 5 value categories. So the 5 value categories are valued workforce that includes both workers and farmers, environmental sustainability, animal welfare, local economies, health and nutrition, healthy and nutritious nutrition and healthy communities, right? So before the good food process purchasing policy, there are constituencies in each of those silos, right? But most of us don't have the bandwidth to actually work across those silos. And what was the promise of the good food purchasing policy is the first thing you got to do is pass an ordinance and get it implemented. So everybody has their own dog in the fight, right? Everybody's focused on their animal welfare or meatpacking worker, right? But in the beginning, you got to go get the policy, and everybody has to work together, and hopefully you build your relationships in that coalition, because there's going to be challenges later on. There's going to be tension between those constituencies, but hopefully you build a strong enough relationship where you can have the honest discussions and find the compromises and the solutions to work together. So the seafood, the other sectors definitely come in. I think that coalition thing, and I think there could be, and there already is there's already a strong climate sort of theme in the good, there is a climate theme built into the environmental standards in particular in the good food. So climate activists could plug into these coalitions, and we could have those coalitions, definitely pivot towards the climate debate around food. Right, and hopefully develop consensus among these different constituencies that we can agree on, and then make climate clearly is a rising challenge that is part of that debate.
Great. Yeah. And, the Chicago has, as you had in your slide, has a good food purchasing policy. Minneapolis has it. So I think from upper Midwest and certainly a Wisconsin perspective, there's a lot of buying power in those urban areas that, people could could work to see if they can meet those criteria and get in relationship with the institutional buyers and other people that are using that as a way to open the door for these key values. We had a question about, is there a place where there's more information about the worker farmer owned processing model? Is there anything published out there, or should people just get in touch with you directly for more information? What's the best plan for that?
No, there isn't any. The one, they'd be better off just, if people are interested, get a hold of me. Where I start with that when people are interested is I do have a presentation on the Our Harvest Co-op. But again, that's just the worker owned. But if I put that out there, it makes a lot of the same arguments. And then you just add on. I haven't got around to like doing the slideshow on the farmer labor because we don't have one yet. We need to get one. But we could get as far as saying, this is the direction we're going. This is where we'd like to go with the Farmer Labor Alliance, and that you would add to this model the farmer ownership model.
Great.
Oh, no,
okay.
Sorry,
well,
I have a lot on that.
That's okay. We'll keep asking you to talk about it, so you have to put together slide presentations. We had another question come in here. Do you see opportunities around developing markets for animals like sheep and goats that might be better for the climate than cattle? They can be pastured, as can chicken and pigs. And perhaps opportunities for developing cooperative processing infrastructure in a developing market that isn't as dominated by the big meat packers.
I mean, sure, you can go create these neat niche markets, and people do that. The problem is sort of the Ben and Jerry's syndrome. As soon as those niche market businesses get to where they're actually making it and valuable and cashing in on that premium, what often happens at that point, like happened with Ben and Jerry's, is Unilever comes in and buys them out, right? And this is the concern with Vilsack's $2 billion that he's put on the table, is actually if somehow some of these packing plants actually do that and get up and running and find their premium or get their school contracts and kind of get over the hump and up and running and maybe even get a premium that's attractive. What's going to stop Tyson from plopping a bunch of money down on the table and buying that business, right? So the argument is, if you don't do, the skeptics to Vilsack are saying, if you don't have the stomach to do the antitrust enforcement that's needed, this $2 billion ain't going to do it, because you're just spending $2 billion for Tyson to buy it later. Right. So that's the problem, is you can't just focus on the marketing because somebody will take it away or keep you out. But people do it. And as long as you keep them under the radar, those things, there is some of that happening. And I think part of it is to scale those models that are sort of under the radar. I think you have to scale them up at some point. And that's where I think the procurement comes in that could help. Without antitrust enforcement, if you can scale some of these models up, get their price point down so you can get a bid into Minneapolis public schools that's within 10% of the low bid, then maybe that gets you there. Now, the other thing that we've talked about in Minneapolis, where we have organized at UFCW, we've organized all 13 of the food co-ops in Minneapolis. So one of the ideas would be, the apprenticeship program that we got in from 1189, the grant proposal was actually in conjunction with 3 of our grocery store employers that we already had, who have meat departments but have no workers to staff those meat departments. And so this was a meat cutters apprenticeship, and under the apprenticeship laws, under the Department of Labor laws, a union and a willing employer who has a union contract can create a trust that is eligible to go get these grants, and those grants will pay for the development of the curriculum, and then they will also pay a subsidy to whichever employer makes their operation the training plant. right? So in this case, if we had, when we get that grant would provide 6,000, it would help develop the curriculum. Now we already have a meat cutters curriculum. We have 2 left in the whole country. We used to have hundreds of them across the country, and now there's 2 left, one in Seattle and one in Northern California. So we have the template for the curriculum, but what you need is extra money to pay that apprentice make that a real job that they're getting paid for. And that's what these labor department grants do. So in this grant, it would have paid up to $6,000 per worker to the employer, who's going through that apprenticeship and getting trained. So that's what I mean by that could bring in a whole new like you get a farmer-owned, worker-owned meatpacking plant up and running and go in together and get a funding from the Department of Labor on top of whatever financing you got from USDA to get the plant off the ground. That's actually going into your operations. And I've talked to like Mike Callicrate and others about, they would kill to have an apprenticeship program. So because there are no meat cutters left. That's one of the obstacles to the good meat thing, is they phase that out. They have the big packers phased out skilled meat cutters years ago and put case ready in the plant in place of that you send the case to Walmart, and there are no skilled meat cutters to be found anymore. So it's a big challenge trying to even find someone it's a tough skill.
Yeah, and I appreciate you talking about that a bit. When we have been looking at the meat supply chains in the Grassland 2.0 context, we've been starting to be in conversation with the technical colleges. There's some activity in Wisconsin in the high schools to get some initial training and just interest generation among high school students in meat cutting. So I think, we don't have the pipeline of people to get into these critical jobs, and that farmers have been feeling the pinch of then just not being able. It's part of how they're not being able to get their animals in to be slaughtered and butchered because there's a shortage of these skilled workers, even in the small and medium plants. And then the only alternative is to try to go into the big plants, but either they're too small, or then there's no price there for sure if they're having to
certainly
try to supply.
I've seen quite a bit of that. There are a lot of more and more of that happening with community colleges and others doing curriculum. But basically, the student has to pay for that. Whoever the worker is gonna usually have to pay for it, and that's the difference between, what some of them even call them apprenticeships. They're not apprenticeships. An apprenticeship is you actually are working in the plant and getting paid as a worker, and you get paid at an entry level. And as you learn the curriculum and move up the skill set, you actually get wage increases along the way, and you're actually getting paid to do that, not having to pay the college to do that, right? So that's the difference.
Yeah,
that's what we
that's important.
That's what we bring to the table from the union side that not many others, if anybody, brings.
Yeah, great. Well, I realize we are up at 1:30 Central here. I really, really appreciate you sharing this systems thinking with us, Dennis, here on the Grassland 2.0 digital dialogue. I looked, we were up at 95 people at the height. So that's great. And thanks to everyone who stuck around here and the good questions. And this has been recorded, so, we'll be able to put a link up, and if there's people that couldn't make it, but you want them to hear it, for those of you out there, we'll, look for a link and we can share this around. This is really important in thinking about what we do on the land, what it means for our communities, our farmers, the workers, how we can build a just and vibrant system. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Bye, everybody. Have a good day.